This video is one I've been wanting to make for a very long time, and I know that many of you have been really eager for me to make a video on this topic as well. I've received many messages over the past year saying things like, one of the challenges I face is I forget my words when I need them in a conversation. How would you overcome that? I can articulate my thoughts on paper, but when I go to speak, I forget what I want to say. In my native language, I can express myself well, but when I speak English, I can't remember the right words to use. All of these comments and questions raise the issue of forgetting words when you speak. This isn't helpful when you're an ambitious professional or an emerging leader and you really want to establish that you're an intelligent and competent professional. Because one of the things that happens when you forget words when you speak is that you have a longer than necessary pause. Now, pauses are important and they can be really effective when used in the right way, but when you are forgetting the words when you speak, a longer than necessary pause can invite other people to jump into the conversation and to take the conversation away from you. And they can also damage your perceived level of credibility and competence as well. So in this video, I'm tackling the very common issue of why you forget words when you speak and what you can do about it. But first, before we jump into the content, I really want to emphasize that this happens to everybody. You are not the only one who forgets words when you speak. You might feel like it only happens to you when you are communicating and it never happens to anyone else. But the majority of people at one stage or another will forget words when they speak. In most cases, it can be really easily overcome when you have an understanding of what is causing you to forget words when you speak and some strategies to try and work through that. The most common reason why you forget words when you speak is because fear overtakes you. This includes the fear of speaking publicly to a large audience or the fear of speaking to one or two people. Regardless of the size of the audience, if fear overtakes you, this will definitely prevent you from thinking clearly and therefore speaking clearly as well. Solomon Assine, author of Think Fast, Speak Smart, says, "Fear can cripple the mind and temporarily distort or erase its content, leaving its victim helpless." This is how it happens. When you are scared or when you perceive a threat, the fight or flight response kicks in to respond to the danger that you perceive or that you sense. In prehistoric times, this was really helpful because it allowed you to flee from danger or to fight when you needed to. But in meetings, if this happens to you, it is much less helpful. In the moment of fight or flight response, your body will release adrenaline or stress hormones to give it a kind of kickstart so you can run to safety or fight for survival. It gives priority to these survival functions, and in this moment, it switches off all non-essential physiological functions that your body has, like digestion or cognitive thinking, which isn't helpful when you need to communicate clearly and remember your words. Basically, your entire body gets itself ready for a major and an immediate reaction to the threat that you perceive, the threat of speaking in front of people. It sounds silly, doesn't it? That the threat of such a simple task like speaking to people can put your body in such a dramatic state. So now we're going to talk about how to move through this fear of speaking to people so it no longer prevents you from thinking clearly and remembering your words when you need them. First, you need to identify what you are scared of. Is it the size of the audience that you're scared of? Is it a large audience that you're scared of? Is it the level of seniority or intelligence of the audience you're speaking to? Are you worried about sounding dumb to them? Is it because they're new people you're speaking to? You haven't quite sized them up and you're worried about what they'll think about you? Is it because it's a high-stake situation or a really important speaking opportunity, like a job interview? When you identify the fear, why you're scared of speaking in this situation, it's much easier for you to deal with because in most cases you realize how inconsequential that fear is. It's also really important to breathe using deep breathing exercises. This is where you breathe down into your diaphragm, this area just below your rib cage. Breathe down into this area deep and breathe out all of the oxygen as well, and do that 3 to 5 times, and that will put you in an immediate state of relaxation. Deep breathing is the only way to bring enough oxygen to your brain, which is where you need the oxygen for clear thinking and clear communication. So stand tall, breathe down into your diaphragm, repeat this 3 to 5 times. It's also important that you speak more often because the more exposed you are to speaking more often in situations that you might find a little uncomfortable, the more comfortable you will be with it and less likely to trigger the fight or flight response. Like with any fear, when you face it, quite often we realize it's not as bad as we think. Whereas when you hide from that fear, it gets bigger in your mind and it feels like it's insurmountable. So speak up more in meetings, ask more questions, volunteer to join group discussions or panels. An important thing I want to mention about stress is that some stress is good. It can make you more alert. It can help your brain to perform better. But if the stress is too prolonged or if it's too severe, then it can harm your memory and it can harm your learning as well. It overtakes your body and it can harm your learning, your memory, and your communication as well. So try to keep your fear and your stress in check. Sometimes fear has nothing to do at all with you forgetting your words. You could be perfectly comfortable speaking in front of people, a small audience or a large audience, yet you still forget your words. This is often an issue of having passive vocabulary rather than active vocabulary. Let me explain. Passive vocabulary is vocabulary we understand from listening and reading. Active vocabulary is vocabulary we use when speaking and writing. We usually have a much larger range of passive vocabulary that we understand when listening and when reading. For example, she vehemently denied being late for the meeting. When we hear vehemently in this sentence, either from memory or from context, we know that it means strongly or forcefully. But in spoken communication, when you're using active vocabulary, it's more likely that you would say something like, she strongly denied she was late for the meeting. It's simpler, more common, and easier to remember and recall. So sometimes when we don't remember our words, it's because that vocabulary isn't active. We don't use it enough, or it might be too complicated for us to remember. The fix to this is move the vocabulary from passive to active. Plan out what you want to say. Write it out word for word using the active vocabulary. Prepare questions in advance using active vocabulary. And whenever you hear a word that you would like to use and incorporate in your communication more often, then write it down and try to commit it to memory, which is what we'll talk about in the next point. Committing new vocabulary to memory is incredibly important so you can level up your communication and use that new vocabulary when you speak. Otherwise, it gets lost in your memory with all of the other things that you need to retain, and it never becomes part of your active vocabulary. When committing anything to memory, the way you encode it and the way you store it is incredibly important. These two steps play an incredibly important role in you being able to retrieve and access those words when you want to use them. So if you constantly forget words when you speak, it could be an issue of encoding and storing those words in your memory. Let me be clear, it's not an issue with your memory. It's about how you go about using it. Let's break these two concepts down in more detail. So encoding happens in the initial stages of learning when you are first exposed to a new word or a new piece of information. Your brain encounters this information and it needs to change it into a usable form, something more meaningful so you can remember it and recall it at a later time. You also need to be more aware and alert when you first learn this new information so you have a better chance at encoding it better. Whereas if you're tired or a bit sluggish or bored, you have much less chance of encoding that information well and therefore remembering it well. So that's encoding. Now storing is next. This is the holding or retaining of information or of the words that you learn. Storing starts in your short-term memory, and then with enough exposure, it moves to your long-term memory so you can retrieve and access it at a later time. When information is stored poorly, that's when you have trouble trying to remember and recall what that information is. It doesn't mean that you don't have that information anymore. It just means you can't find it. It's just like when you put a new sweater in the wrong drawer. It doesn't mean you've lost the sweater. It just means you don't know where it is. So how can we better encode and store new vocabulary? Well, when it comes to encoding, when you come across a new word, look it up in the dictionary, get the meaning and clearly understand what that word means. Write that word down in a notebook of some kind with the definition alongside of it. Use it in a sentence, either spoken or written, something that is meaningful that will help you to remember and understand what that word means. When it comes to storing, it also helps to say that word out loud. You can also use memorization techniques like spaced repetition, chunking, rhyming, acronyms, or visual connections. There are many YouTube videos that will help you learn memorization techniques. One of the best people who teach this is Jim Kwik. So check out his videos once you have finished this one. When you encode and store new vocabulary properly, you can commit it to memory so you can retrieve it, which is what we talk about in the next point. Reason number 4 as to why you forget words when you speak is because you can't retrieve your vocabulary. You may have stored and encoded that vocabulary well, but you can't seem to find those words and retrieve them when you need them. A classic example of this is the tip of the tongue moment, when you have a vague idea of the word that you want to use. It might even flash past your eyes in your mind, but you can't seem to grab onto it and be clear on what that word is. Retrieval is incredibly important in any communication opportunity. Solomon Assine, the author of Think Fast, Speak Smart, he says, when we speak, it's a constant retrieval of information from your memory as you make your points, state your case, or share your message. When retrieval is difficult, you struggle to speak fluently. That's something you might be able to relate to. How can you overcome this? How can you retrieve words better or more often so you can communicate better overall? It comes down to a number of techniques that tend to work in unison. So I'm going to talk about 4 techniques right now. Number 1, use the words in your memory more often. The words that you use and access more often are easier to recall. Use those words in spoken communication, in written communication, and in spaced repetition. Number 2, keep the brain active. Do activities like Sudoku, crosswords, chess, or learn a new language. Exercise the brain so it functions better. Number 3, exercise yourself. Do some kind of sport or physical activity to move the oxygen to your brain, which is where you need it, as I mentioned, for communication and clear thinking. Number 4, get sleep. Studies have shown that lack of sleep hurts memory. On the flip side though, an adequate amount of sleep can help memory performance. So if you have difficulty in forgetting your words, if you can't remember words when you speak, then maybe it's because you haven't had enough sleep the night before. A lot of what I focused on in this video is about building vocabulary, committing it to memory, and retrieving it. You can learn more about these topics in these 2 videos right here. Don't forget to tune into my podcast, The Leadership Pod. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and many other podcasting platforms. I'll put the link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you got a lot of value from it. If you did like this video, hit the like button below. Subscribe to my channel for more videos like this every week, and I will see you next week in another video.